The silence in the apartment was a living thing, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound except the frantic beating of Clara's own heart. Each wall was bare, scarred with the pale ghosts of where picture frames once hung, memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She knelt on the cold, dusty floor, the rough wood pressing into her knees as she taped the last cardboard box shut. Her hands, usually nimble and sure from years at a sewing machine, trembled. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, cold and bitter. She could hear her children in the bedroom, the soft murmur of 8-year-old Leo reading to his 5-year-old sister, Mia. Their innocence was a sharp, painful contrast to the crushing weight on Clara's chest, a physical ache that had taken root the day her husband, David, had closed his eyes for the last time. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It felt like the last drop of water in a vast, unforgiving desert. The eviction notice lay crumpled on the kitchen counter, its stark red letters a brand on her soul. It had all happened so fast. David's illness had been a sudden, brutal storm, and the medical bills that followed were the flood that washed everything away. They took the savings. They took the furniture. Now they were taking the roof over her children's heads. Clara pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes, trying to force back the image of the hospital bills, a stack of paper that represented a debt so large it felt like a mountain she was meant to carry on her back forever. Her stomach twisted with a familiar gnawing hunger, but the thought of food was repulsive. All she could taste was fear. The air, thick with the smell of dust and finality, felt too thin to breathe. She was failing. The thought was a relentless drumbeat against her skull. I am failing them. Outside, the old station wagon sagged under the weight of everything they owned in the world. Inside Clara's worn leather wallet, nestled between a faded photo of David and a grocery list from a happier time, were 10 $20 bills. $200. That was it. That was the barrier, standing between her children and the cold, indifferent streets. She listened to the hum of the city beyond the window, a world that was moving on without them. The sound of Mia's gentle cough from the other room sent a fresh shiver of panic down her spine. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in cruel, beautiful shades of orange and purple. But for Clara, the approaching darkness wasn't in the sky. It was a terrifying, suffocating void, the absolute uncertainty of where they would sleep tomorrow. Everything was gone. The phone rang just as the last of the twilight bled from the sky, a shrill, alien sound in the suffocating quiet of the packed car. Clara, parked on a dusty side road to let the kids sleep, felt her heart seize. An unknown number. Every instinct screamed not to answer, to let it go, to preserve the tiny, fragile bubble of anonymity she now occupied. But a deeper, more desperate part of her, the part that still clung to the absurd notion of miracles, forced her thumb to swipe the screen. Her voice was a dry whisper. "Hello." The man on the other end was clipped, professional. He introduced himself as David's former pro bono lawyer, a name she vaguely recalled from the whirlwind of paperwork after the funeral. Her blood ran cold. Another bill, another complication? She felt the familiar nausea rise, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the steering wheel. Bracing for another blow she was sure she couldn't withstand. The silence on the line stretched, heavy with unspoken dread, the air in the car suddenly feeling thick and unbreathable. "Ms. Alves," the lawyer began, his tone devoid of emotion. "I'm calling about your late husband's estate. There wasn't much, as you know, but a single asset has cleared probate. It seems a distant uncle, a Ricardo Vargas, left him a property years ago." Clara held her breath, the world narrowing to the voice in her ear. A property. The words echoed in the cavern of her despair. "It's a small cabin," the lawyer continued, "on a lake, quite remote. According to the will, it is now legally yours." A tiny, impossible spark ignited in the cold darkness of her chest. It was a fragile warmth, a feeling so alien she barely recognized it. Hope. He used the phrase, rent-free, and to Clara, it sounded like a choir of angels. It felt like a divine hand reaching down into the abyss she was falling into, its fingers brushing against hers. For the first time in months, she felt something other than pure, suffocating panic. It was a lifeline, thin as a spider's thread, but it was there, and she clung to it with all her might. The lawyer couriered a scanned copy of a hand-drawn map to her email, The only way to find the place, he'd said. There was no formal address. The words remote and isolated were repeated, but they didn't register as warnings. To Clara, they sounded like private and safe, a place where no eviction notice could find them, where her children wouldn't have to witness her shame on a daily basis. She ended the call, her hand trembling as she stared at her phone. The map was a crude drawing of winding roads and landmarks like Old Oak Tree and Split Rock. It was a pirate's map, and the treasure was a roof over their heads. The decision wasn't a decision at all. It was a reflex, the desperate gasp for air of a drowning woman. Tears of profound relief streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. She looked at her sleeping children in the rearview mirror, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the storm that had just broken inside her. They were saved. She was sure of it. She had to be. The decision was made in a heartbeat. There was no other choice. She gently woke the children, forcing a brightness into her voice that felt brittle and fake. "We're going on an adventure," she said, her smile feeling tight on her face. "To a little house on a lake." Mia's eyes lit up with sleepy excitement, but Leo, ever watchful, just stared at her, his 8-year-old gaze filled with a weary understanding that broke his mother's heart. Clara filled the gas tank with most of her remaining money, the click and whir of the pump sounding like a final countdown. She spent the last of it on a bag of cheap bread, peanut butter, and bottles of water. The meager supplies felt like a feast, a provision for their new life. As she pulled the groaning station wagon back onto the highway, leaving the city lights behind for good, she felt a surge of terrifying, exhilarating freedom. Every mile put between them and their old life felt like a victory. Her step away from the failure that had haunted her for so long. The journey was an odyssey into the unknown. The car, a relic from a happier time, rattled and whined with every bump, and Clara's hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. She felt every vibration, every cough of the old engine, convinced it would die and leave them stranded on the side of the road. The smell of exhaust mixed with the cheap pine tree air freshener David had hung from the mirror years ago, a scent that was both comforting and agonizing. She drove for hours, her body screaming with exhaustion, her eyes burning from staring at the endless ribbon of asphalt unfolding before them. She drove through the night, powered by caffeine and the sheer force of her will. The hum of the tires on the road was a hypnotic mantra, a prayer for deliverance. She imagined the cabin, a cozy haven with a warm fire, the scent of pine wood, and the sound of her children laughing. This vision was the only thing keeping her awake, the only thing keeping the despair at bay. As dawn broke, the landscape began to transform. The flat, sprawling highways of the suburbs gave way to winding country roads, flanked by rolling hills and dense, dark forests. The air that came through the open windows changed, losing its city grit and taking on the clean, earthy smell of damp soil and pine needles. The road signs became less frequent, the towns smaller and further apart. Eventually, the smooth pavement gave way to the crunch and rattle of a gravel road. The sounds of civilization faded completely, replaced by the whispering of the wind through the tall trees and the chattering of unseen birds. The children, lulled by the car's motion, slept soundly in the back seat, their soft, even breaths a stark contrast to the frantic beating of Clara's heart. She felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling of being completely untethered from the world she knew. It was both terrifying and liberating. The sun was high in the sky when she turned off the gravel road and onto a dirt track that was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and grass. This was the final leg of the journey, according to the faded map on her phone. The car bucked and groaned as it navigated the deep ruts. Long, thorny branches scraped against the sides of the station wagon, a high-pitched, screeching sound like fingernails on a chalkboard that made Clara's teeth ache. The forest closed in around them, the canopy so thick it cast the path in a perpetual twilight. A cold finger of doubt traced its way down her spine. The lawyer had said it was remote, but this felt like something else entirely. This felt like the end of the world. She glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above empty. There was no turning back now. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, a cold premonition that the beautiful picture in her mind was about to be ripped to shreds. And then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. The car's tired suspension sighed as she rolled to a stop, the engine idling with a rough cough. Clara stared, her breath catching in her throat. The hope that had carried her for hundreds of miles, The fragile, beautiful dream of a sanctuary, shattered into a million sharp, glittering pieces. It was not a cabin, it was a carcass. The structure, if it could be called that, leaned precariously to one side, a wounded animal on the verge of collapse. The headlights had died hours ago, but in the harsh midday sun, every flaw was brutally exposed. The porch had rotted through and fallen in on itself, creating a jagged maw of splintered wood. The roof, its shingles long gone, sagged in the middle like a broken back. She felt the blood drain from her face. She had driven them all this way, spent their last dollar, for this, for a ruin. The air here felt different, heavy and wet and charged with a profound sense of neglect and sorrow. She turned off the rattling engine, and the world plunged into an unnerving silence. A silence so profound it felt loud, pressing in on her ears. Slowly she opened the car door, the creak of its hinges sounding like a scream in the dead air. The smell hit her first, a physical blow. It was a thick, complex stench of decay, the damp, musty odor of rot, the pungent smell of animal nests, and the cloying sweetness of wet as decomposing leaves. It filled her lungs and made her stomach heave. The only sounds were the maddeningly high-pitched drone of mosquitoes and the faint, almost imperceptible lapping of water somewhere nearby in the darkness. The lake, she couldn't see it, but she could feel its cold, damp breath on her skin. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her, but the chill was coming from within. This place was not just abandoned. It felt diseased, a festering wound in the middle of nowhere. Her body went numb, a cold dread seeping into her very bones. Her eyes, now accustomed to the gloom under the trees, took in the full horror of the exterior. It was worse than she first thought. The wooden walls were stained dark with moisture, and entire planks were missing, revealing the darkness within. The few windows that weren't boarded up were shattered, their jagged edges like broken teeth in a skull's grin. They were dark, vacant eyes staring out into the oppressive gloom. A single shutter, miraculously still attached, hung by a single rusty hinge. It swung back and forth in the slight breeze, creating a rhythmic, agonizing creak, 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 that grated on her already frayed nerves. It sounded like a lonely, maddening metronome counting down the seconds to a complete breakdown. Every detail was a fresh stab of despair. This wasn't a home. It was a monument to decay, a place where hope had come to die. She felt a wave of dizziness, the forest seeming to spin around her. Taking a deep, shaky breath that only filled her lungs with more of the foul air, she stumbled towards the front door. It hung ajar, swollen and warped in its frame. She gave it a push. It resisted, wedged tight by damp and time, then surrendered with a low, agonizing groan of wood scraping against wood and the shriek of its overburdened hinges. The darkness inside was absolute, a solid wall of black that seemed to absorb the light. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with cold sweat, and turned on the flashlight. The weak beam trembled in her hand, cutting a pathetic, narrow path into the gloom. What it revealed made her heart plummet into her shoes. The walls were not wood-paneled. They were covered in a creeping, branching filigree of black mold. It looked like a living, breathing thing, a dark, malevolent ivy that was slowly consuming the house from the inside out. Her hope, which had shattered moments before, now felt like it was being ground into dust under the heel of a cruel joke. The beam of light danced across the single room, revealing a scene of complete and utter dereliction. The floor was a soft, squelching carpet of damp leaves, mud, and what looked like years of animal droppings. The smell was overpowering in the enclosed space, a gag-inducing mix of mold and ammonia. The furniture consisted of a few skeletal remains, a collapsed table, a three-legged chair, and a mattress in the corner that was stained and ripped, its stuffing spilling out like entrails. As she swept the light across the floor, a large rat scurried from under the mattress, its claws making a dry, scratching sound that echoed in the dead air. Clara flinched back with a small cry, her stomach churning violently. A profound and chilling despair, colder and deeper than anything she had felt in the city, settled over her like a shroud. This was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb. It was a trap. The lawyer's words, rent-free, now sounded like a curse. The practical realities of their situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Her hand, acting on some forgotten instinct of normalcy, found a light switch on the wall. She flicked it. Nothing. She flicked it again and again, the useless click echoing in the oppressive silence. The electricity was dead. She pulled out her phone, her last link to civilization, and stared at the screen. No service. Not a single bar. The words seemed to mock her, confirming her worst fear. The isolation was complete, a physical wall cutting them off from the entire world. They were utterly and completely alone, stranded in a rotting box, with two small children, a nearly empty gas tank, and no way to call for help. The faint hope that had bloomed in her chest just yesterday now felt like a cruel and distant memory. A lie she had foolishly told herself. The warmth was gone, replaced by an icy dread that numbed her from head to toe. Her body began to tremble uncontrollably, a violent shudder that started in her core and radiated out to her fingertips. The gnawing hunger in her stomach had vanished, replaced by a hollow, acidic pit of pure terror. Tears welled up in her eyes, but these were different from the hot tears of grief she had shed for David, or the panicked tears of her eviction. These were cold, silent tears of utter, soul-crushing defeat. A primal scream of rage and despair was building in her chest, a raw animal sound that clawed at her throat, but she choked it down. She couldn't break, not in front of them. The realization struck her that she had been a fool, a desperate, naive fool who had chased a fantasy into the heart of a nightmare. The weight on her shoulders was heavier than ever before, a crushing burden of failure and fear. She was a captain who had steered her ship directly onto the rocks. She forced herself to turn away from the ruin and look at her children, who were huddled together just inside the doorway, their small forms silhouetted against the day's fading light. Leo's face was a mask of fear, his hand gripping the hem of her jeans so tightly his knuckles were white. Mia had started to cry, not loudly, but with soft, hopeless sobs that were swallowed by the oppressive silence of the rotting cabin. The sound pierced Clara's heart more sharply than any physical pain. In that moment, a terrifyingly clear thought crystallized in her mind. She hadn't hit rock bottom when she was evicted. She hadn't hit rock bottom when she had only $200 to her name. Rock bottom was this isolated, decaying shack, miles from anyone, with no electricity, no phone, and no escape. This was the true abyss. The hope had been a lie, a cruel trick of fate designed to lead her here, to this place where she was more trapped and more helpless than ever before. The first week in the cabin was a blur of grim, monotonous labor, fueled by stale peanut butter and a terrifyingly potent survival instinct. Clara worked from the gray, hazy light of dawn until the deep, oppressive black of night, her body screaming with a dull, constant ache. She sealed the broken windows with cardboard from their packing boxes, the tape holding precariously against the damp air. The stench of mold was a constant companion, a thick film at the back of her throat. Every night, a relentless, chilling draft snaked its way up from the floorboards near the hearth, a cold Yao's invisible river that settled in her bones and made Mia cough in her sleep. Clara felt the cough in her own chest, a phantom echo of the illness that had stolen David and now threatened to creep into this new, wretched chapter of their lives. It was this draft, this persistent, icy finger of the outside world, that became her obsession. It was a tangible enemy she could fight in a sea of overwhelming, abstract despair. She decided the source had to be a loose floorboard, armed with a rusty hammer she'd found in the shed and a handful of nails salvaged from a collapsed shelf. She set to work. The floor was a patchwork of warped, water-stained planks. She tapped each one, listening for the hollow sound that would betray the gap. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay that rose from beneath the floor. Her hands, raw and blistered, fumbled with the hammer. Leo watched her, his face a small, serious mask of concern. He wasn't playing. He never played anymore. He simply watched, his dark eyes absorbing every detail of their grim reality. He pointed a small, dirty finger at a board near the crumbling stone of the fireplace. "This one, Mama," he whispered, his voice barely a sound in the heavy silence. "It wiggles." He was right. When she pressed on it with her hand, the plank shifted with a soft, squelching sound, revealing a dark, spidery gap along its edge. Prying it up was a Herculean effort. The wood was swollen with moisture, and the rusted nails fought her every inch of the way, their screeching protest echoing in the dead air of the cabin. Finally, with a great, splintering crack, the board came loose. A wave of musty, subterranean air washed over them, a smell of deep, undisturbed earth and something else, something metallic and forgotten. Clara felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She peered into the dark space beneath, her phone's weak flashlight cutting a trembling circle into the gloom. The space was a shallow crawl space, filled with cobwebs as thick as cotton and the debris of 100 years, but nestled in the dirt, directly under the loose plank, was something that didn't belong. It wasn't a rock or a piece of rotted wood. It was a small, dark object, its shape obscured by a thick coat of grime and dust. Her heart gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter, not of hope, but of pure, unadulterated curiosity. Leo, smaller and quicker, reached into the gap before she could stop him. His fingers closed around the object, and he pulled it out into the dim light. "I found a treasure," he said, his voice holding a spark of its old childhood wonder for the first time in weeks. He rubbed it on his sleeve, wiping away decades of filth. It was a key, not a simple, modern key, but an old one, made of heavy brass that had tarnished to a deep, dark brown. It was ornate, with an intricate, floral-patterned head and a complex, toothed bit unlike any she had ever seen. It felt cold and solid in her palm, a piece of a story she couldn't begin to guess. She felt a prickle of unease run up her spine. A key to what? A forgotten pantry? A locked chest of old clothes? In this place, it was more likely a key to nothing. Another piece of meaningless junk. Another dead end in a house built of dead ends. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something significant. The discovery of the key shifted something in the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. It introduced a new element, a tiny, vibrating question mark in the flat, grey landscape of their survival. For the first time, Clara's actions were not purely about staving off the immediate threats of cold, hunger, or despair. Now, there was a puzzle. She tried the key on the swollen front door lock. It didn't fit. She tried it on the padlocked cellar door on the outside of the cabin, a door so rusted it looked like it was welded shut. The key wouldn't even slide in. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a strange, obsessive scavenger hunt, with Leo and a hesitant Mia trailing behind her. They tried the key on a rotting trunk in the attic, its leather straps crumbling to dust at her touch. They tried it on a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the main room, but the key was too large for the delicate keyhole. With each failure, a small bit of the initial excitement withered. Her rational mind told her to stop, to focus on the real problems, like their dwindling food supply or the worrying state of the car's gas tank, but the weight of the key in her pocket was a constant, nagging reminder. It was a loop, a question that demanded an answer. The search became a desperate distraction, a way to channel her frantic energy into a task with a potential, however slim, for a positive outcome. It was better than staring at the mold creeping up the walls, better than listening to the sound of her own heart beating in the terrifying silence of the nights. The key was a mystery, and for a few hours the mystery was more compelling than the misery. It represented the only thing in this entire forsaken place that wasn't decaying, the only thing that held a secret instead of just rot. She could feel a thread of an untold story, and she felt an overwhelming compulsion to pull on it, no matter where it led. The search inside the cabin yielded nothing. Every lock was either too small, too rusted, or simply the wrong shape. A familiar wave of disappointment washed over her, cold and bitter. It was just another piece of junk. She had wasted an entire afternoon, a precious commodity, chasing a fantasy. As the sun began to dip below the thick canopy of trees, casting long, menacing shadows across the clearing, she almost gave up. She sank onto the broken porch steps, the cold, damp wood seeping through her thin jeans. Her gaze drifted toward the edge of the property, towards the sound of the lapping water she had learned to tune out. There, half hidden by overgrown cattails and a fallen birch tree, was the skeletal remains of the boat shed the lawyer had mentioned. Its roof had caved in, and its walls leaned at a drunken angle, looking as if a strong gust of wind would finish the job of demolishing it completely. It was a place she had actively avoided, a symbol of ultimate decay, but as she stared at the wreck, a thought, faint and persistent, nudged at the edge of her consciousness. A boat shed, by a lake. People locked things up in sheds, tools, motors, equipment. She felt a fresh, albeit hesitant, surge of adrenaline. Her stomach fluttered with a nervous energy she hadn't felt since she'd first seen the hand-drawn map. It was a long shot, a fool's errand to venture into that death trap of rotting timber and rusted metal, but the key felt heavy in her pocket, a silent goad. "Stay here," she told Leo, her voice firmer than she felt. "Don't move from this spot." She grabbed the rusty hammer, its weight a meager comfort in her hand, and started picking her way through the tall, wet grass towards the collapsed structure. The air grew colder as she neared the water's edge, and the smell of the lake, a damp, fishy, organic smell, grew stronger, mingling with the ever-present odor of rot from the shed itself. This felt different. This felt dangerous. Getting inside the boat shed was treacherous. The main door had long since rotted off its hinges and lay half submerged in the marshy ground. Clara had to climb over a collapsed section of the wall, sharp, splintered planks snagging at her clothes. The floor inside was a soupy, treacherous mire of mud, lake water, and decomposing leaves. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of stagnant water and mildew. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a chaotic mess, rusted fishing hooks, tangled lines, and the brittle, skeletal remains of what might have been a small boat. It was a junk pile, a grave for forgotten things. Disappointment settled in her chest again, heavy and suffocating. She had been a fool to come in here. She was about to turn back, to retreat to the relative safety of the main cabin, when her light caught something. It wasn't a glint of metal, but the opposite. It was a patch of floor that seemed wrong. In the far corner, beneath a pile of rotting fishing nets, the floorboards were different, while the rest of the floor was a patchwork of mismatched, decaying planks. This small section was made of newer, cleaner wood. The planks were laid too perfectly, their seams too tight. It was a patch, a repair, but it was a repair made with care, a stark contrast to the neglect that surrounded it. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She dropped to her knees in the cold muck, ignoring the water that soaked through her jeans. She tore away the stiff, smelly nets, her hands shaking. There it was. A small, almost invisible seam around a rectangular section of the floor, and in the center, a recessed brass ring, tarnished to the same dark color as the key in her pocket. It was a trapdoor, a hidden compartment. She felt a dizzying, terrifying thrill. The mystery wasn't dead. It was just beginning. Prying open the false bottom was another battle. The wood was swollen and wedged tight. She jammed the claw of the hammer into the seam and pulled with all her might, her muscles screaming in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan and the sucking sound of releasing pressure, the trapdoor lifted. The space beneath was not deep, maybe only 2 feet, and inside that space, nestled on a bed of dry straw that seemed impossibly preserved from the surrounding damp, was a heavy, rust-covered footlocker. It was an old military-style chest, made of thick steel, its surface mottled with patches of orange and brown corrosion. It looked ancient, a relic from another time. And on the front, just above the main latch, was a heavy-duty lock, its keyhole dark and waiting. Her breath caught in her throat. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers suddenly clumsy and numb, and pulled out the ornate brass key. She slid the key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. The cold metal slid home with a smooth, satisfying click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent shed. For a moment, she just knelt there, her hand on the key, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was thick with anticipation. She felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, about to step off into an unknown that could be wonderful or terrible. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm her racing pulse, she turned the key. There was a loud, metallic clank as the internal mechanism, frozen for who knew how many years, finally gave way. The latch popped open. She lifted the heavy lid, its rusty hinges groaning in protest. The sight that greeted her was not what she expected. There was no gleam of gold, no sparkle of jewels. The first thing that hit her was the smell, a dry, clean scent of leather, old paper, and the faint, chemical tang of waterproof oilcloth. The inside of the footlocker was a world unto itself, perfectly preserved against the decay that had consumed everything around it. Everything was wrapped meticulously in thick, brown, waterproof oilcloth, tied securely with twine. It was a time capsule, a deliberate, carefully hidden package of secrets. Her hands trembled as she untied the twine on the largest bundle. The oilcloth was stiff and crackled as she unfolded it. Inside were two thick, leather-bound books. They were accounting ledgers, their pages filled with columns of neat, precise handwriting and endless rows of numbers. She flipped through a few pages, the crisp, dry paper feeling alien in this world of damp and rot. She didn't understand what the numbers meant, but the sheer volume of them, the meticulous detail, spoke of a significant and complex operation. It felt important. It felt dangerous. The numbers seemed to hum with a silent, menacing energy. The second bundle she unwrapped contained a single, smaller book. It was a personal diary, its soft leather cover worn smooth with use. The pages were filled with a dense, slightly slanted script. The ink faded from black to a brownish grey. She opened it to a random page. The words leaped out at her, filled with a frantic energy. "Valois is a monster," she read. "He thinks no one sees, but I see." Her blood ran cold. She snapped the book shut, her heart pounding. Valois. The name meant nothing to her, but the tone of the entry was unmistakable. It was the writing of a man who was terrified, a man who had uncovered something monstrous and was documenting it, perhaps as a final act of defiance. The diary felt hot in her hands, a vessel of pure fear. She suddenly understood that this was not a treasure chest in the traditional sense. The value of these items was not in money, but in information. The final item was the smallest. It was wrapped in its own small square of oilcloth. When she unfolded it, she found a single, clear plastic microcassette tape. It was tiny, a relic from a time before digital recorders, before cell phones. A small, handwritten label was stuck to its side. The writing was tiny, almost microscopic, but she could just make it out. State Inspector. Final conversation. Her stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. A confession. The premisa from the diary entry clicked into place with this tape. An inspector. A confession. A monster named Valois. This wasn't just information, it was proof. The kind of proof people killed for. The kind of proof that could get a woman and her two small children, stranded in the middle of nowhere, into unimaginable trouble. The weight of the footlocker's contents felt immense, a burden far heavier than the steel and rust she had dragged from the mud. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was now the guardian of a secret. She sat back on her heels in the muck and mire of the boat shed, the ledger, the diary, and the tape laid out before her on the oilcloth. The dim light from her phone cast long, dancing shadows that made the cramped space feel like it was closing in on her. A profound and terrible understanding began to dawn. Her husband's uncle, Ricardo Vargas, the man who had left them this sanctuary, hadn't just been a distant relative. He had been a man with a secret so dangerous he had buried it in a rusted box under a false floor in a collapsed shed at the edge of a remote lake. This wasn't a random inheritance. It felt like a deliberate act, a passing of a torch she never asked for. The chill she felt had nothing to do with the damp air or the setting sun. It was the icy touch of a danger that had been lying dormant here for years, waiting for someone to come along and pry open its tomb. She quickly, frantically, rewrapped the items in the oilcloth and placed them back in the footlocker. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the twine. She slammed the heavy lid shut, the sound echoing unnaturally in the confined space, and clicked the lock closed, pocketing the key. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she couldn't leave the footlocker here. It wasn't safe. But where was it safe? The cabin was barely a shelter, not a fortress. Her car was nearly out of gas, a useless metal box. She was trapped here, a prisoner not just of her poverty, but now of this terrible knowledge. The footlocker was both a potential salvation and a potential death sentence. It was a Pandora's box, and she had just opened it. The air in the shed felt suffocating, and she scrambled back out over the broken wall, gasping for fresh air, her heart a wild bird trapped in her chest. The weight of the footlocker was immense as she half-dragged, half-carried it back towards the cabin. Every rustle of leaves in the woods around her sounded like footsteps. Every snap of a twig made her jump, her body flooded with a primal, hunted fear. The forest, which had merely been oppressive and gloomy before, now felt actively malevolent, its shadows filled with unseen eyes. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a lone figure dragging a secret through a landscape that was no longer neutral. The cabin, her ruin, her prison, now looked almost like a sanctuary compared to the terrifying openness of the woods. She shoved the footlocker into the darkest corner of the cabin, throwing a pile of dirty blankets over it, a pathetic attempt at concealment, but she could still feel its presence. A cold, heavy weight in the room, radiating a silent, dangerous energy. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of the old cabin, every sigh of the wind through the broken windows, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She lay on the lumpy, stained mattress, her children sleeping fitfully on either side of her, their small bodies a fragile barricade against the darkness. But the real darkness was inside her head. The words from the diary echoed in her mind. Valois is a monster. Who was Valois? Was he still out there? Did he know about this place? Did he know Ricardo had hidden his secrets here? The questions swirled in her mind, a venomous, exhausting vortex. The hope that had been shattered upon her arrival had been replaced by something far worse, a specific, tangible fear. She was no longer fighting against poverty and homelessness. She was now entangled in a story of corruption and, she suspected, murder. She thought of the microcassette tape. State Inspector. Final conversation. What was on that tape? What last words had been captured? The urge to find a way to listen to it was almost overwhelming, a desperate need to know the full extent of the danger she was in. But she had no way to play it. No electricity, no tape player, nothing. The evidence was both in her possession and completely inaccessible, a frustrating and terrifying paradox. She felt a surge of helpless anger. She had been given the key to a massive, dangerous secret, but she had no way to unlock its meaning, no way to use it, and no way to escape it. The silence of the night pressed in on her, no longer empty, but filled with the ghosts of Ricardo's investigation and the looming shadow of the man named Valois. The mystery had found her, and she had a terrifying feeling it would not let her go. The isolation of the cabin, once a source of despair, now felt like a deadly trap. Before, being cut off from the world meant she couldn't call for help with her poverty. Now, it meant she couldn't call for help with a potential murderer. The lack of phone service, the dead electricity, the miles of empty road, they were no longer just inconveniences. They were strategic weaknesses in a battle she didn't even know how to fight. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a game that had started long before she ever heard of this place. Her husband's inheritance was not a gift. It was a curse, a carefully laid trap that had sprung the moment Leo's small fingers had closed around that tarnished brass key. She closed her eyes. But all she could see were the columns of numbers in the ledger and the frantic, sewn, fearful handwriting in the diary. As dawn finally broke, painting the sky in pale, washed-out shades of grey and pink, Clara knew that nothing was the same. The struggle for survival had been hard, a brutal, physical fight against the elements and despair, but this was different. This was a psychological war, a battle against an unseen enemy. The footlocker in the corner was a silent testament to that. It was a heavy, rusted anchor, chaining her to this place and to a violent past that was not her own. She looked at her sleeping children, their faces peaceful and innocent in the morning light, and a new kind of determination began to solidify within her, hard and cold as steel. The fear was still there, a living thing coiling in her gut, but it was now mixed with a flicker of something else, a grim, protective resolve. She had stumbled into this story, but she would not let it consume her family. She had to know more. She couldn't just sit here and wait for a monster to appear. She gently retrieved the diary from the footlocker, the soft leather feeling cool against her skin. She sat by the grimy window, using the weak morning light to read. She started from the beginning. The early entries were mundane, observations about the lake, notes on fishing, complaints about the weather. Ricardo's handwriting was calm, measured, but then the tone began to shift. He wrote about new neighbors, wealthy people from the city, buying up the old fishing shacks. He wrote about a charming, powerful developer who was hosting parties and making promises about a new luxury resort that would bring prosperity to the struggling region. The developer's name appeared again and again, a dark thread weaving its way through the narrative. Arthur Valois. The name now sent a chill down her spine. The diary became an obsessive chronicle of an investigation. Ricardo, a retired journalist as it turned out, smelled a story. He detailed how small landowners, people who had lived by the lake for generations, were suddenly selling their properties to Valois for suspiciously low prices. Some simply vanished, their cabins left abandoned. The official stories were always plausible. They moved away. They had family emergencies. They had accidents. But Ricardo didn't believe it. He started digging, cross-referencing public records, talking to locals, documenting every inconsistency, every strange coincidence. The diary entries grew shorter, more frantic. He wrote about being followed, about strange noises at night, about a growing certainty that he was in danger. He was documenting a pattern of systematic, ruthless acquisition of land, a modern-day form of conquest disguised as progress. The final entries were terrifying. Ricardo described uncovering proof of forged documents, of shell corporations, of direct payoffs to local officials. He had found the mechanism of the crime. The last entry was dated 2 days before his officially recorded date of death. It was short and chilling. He knows. Valois knows I have it all. The ledgers. The proof. I met with the inspector today. He's terrified, but he's going to do the right thing. I recorded our talk just in case, hiding everything in the shed. It's the only place he won't look. If something happens to me, this is the only trail. Clara closed the diary, her hands trembling violently. An accident. The lawyer had said Ricardo's death was a drowning accident. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. And she was sitting in the middle of the crime scene, holding the very evidence that had gotten him killed. The mystery was no longer a puzzle. It was a gaping wound, and she had just plunged her hands into it. The cabin felt like a tomb, and the diary was its epitaph. Clara sat on the dusty floor, the weak morning light illuminating the frantic, spidery script. Ricardo's words painted a chilling portrait of greed. He listed names: the Millers, old Mr. Henderson, the Sanchez family, all people who had refused to sell their small plots of land to the developer. He described their subsequent misfortunes with a terrifying clarity: a sudden house fire, a fatal fishing trip, a mysterious illness. Each tragedy was followed by a swift, quiet sale of the land to a holding company Clara now knew was a front for Arthur Valois. She felt a cold sweat prickle her skin, the worn leather of the diary feeling slick and sinister in her hands. She could almost hear the voices of the ghosts trapped between these pages, whispering warnings that had come too late. Her own breath hitched in her throat, a small, ragged sound in the suffocating silence of the room. The story wasn't just about land. It was about lives, systematically and ruthlessly extinguished for profit. She turned her attention to the ledgers, the smell of old, dry paper and faded ink filling her nostrils. The neat columns of numbers, which had seemed meaningless before, now screamed with accusation. She traced a finger down a page, matching the names from the diary to the transactions in the ledger. The purchase prices were a pittance, an insult to the lives that had been destroyed. The money trail was a complex web, funneling through a series of shell corporations with anonymous names, all leading back to a single parent company, Valois Lakeside Enterprises. The meticulous detail was staggering. Ricardo had been more than a concerned neighbor. He had been a forensic accountant in his own right, building a case brick by brick, number by number. Clara felt the weight of each entry, each number representing a stolen legacy. Her stomach churned, a knot of acid and fear. This wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was the anatomy of a monster's work, laid bare in cold, hard figures that offered no room for doubt. It was all there. Ricardo Vargas, the man she'd thought was just a distant and eccentric uncle, had been a retired investigative journalist. He hadn't stumbled upon this story. He had hunted it. The cabin wasn't his home. It was his base of operations, a remote outpost from which he waged a silent war against a predator. And he had lost. The official report of his death, a drowning accident, now felt like a cruel joke, a final, cynical flourish from Valois himself. A wave of nausea, so strong it made her head swim, washed over Clara. She imagined Ricardo, a man she'd never met, realizing the net was closing around him, frantically hiding this evidence in the one place he thought it would be safe. He had not just left her a piece of property. He had left her a baton in a deadly relay race, and she was the next runner, standing alone in the darkness. With the finish line nowhere in sight, and the footsteps of the pursuer growing louder with every passing moment. She remained here. And then there was the microcassette tape, the final piece, the smoking gun. She held the small plastic rectangle in her palm, its diminutive size belying the immense power it contained. State Inspector, final conversation. Ricardo had cornered one of Valois' pawns, a corrupt official who knew where the bodies were buried. Both figuratively and, Clara suspected, literally. The inspector had confessed. Ricardo had recorded it. This tape was the one thing that couldn't be explained away. The one piece of evidence that was not just paper and numbers, but a human voice admitting to an atrocity. The realization sent a fresh jolt of pure terror through her. This tape was the reason Ricardo was dead. It was the most dangerous object she had ever held, more deadly than a loaded gun. The desire to hear it was a physical ache, a burning need to know the full truth, but the impossibility of it only amplified her sense of helplessness. She was the keeper of a voice she could not hear, a truth she could not broadcast. The story was now terrifyingly complete in her mind. Arthur Valois, the man whose name was probably on hospitals and university buildings. The celebrated philanthropist and captain of industry Chuo was a murderer, a cold, systematic predator who had been killing people for their land for over a decade. And she, Clara Alves, a widowed seamstress with 2 small children and less than $50 to her name, was sitting in the middle of his personal graveyard, clutching the only evidence in the world that could bring him down. The footlocker wasn't a treasure chest, it was a bomb. Every second she possessed it. The fuse grew shorter. The air in the cabin seemed to crackle with a new, menacing energy. The mold on the walls seemed to writhe, the shadows in the corners deepened, and the silence was no longer empty, but pregnant with a dreadful anticipation. She felt a profound and chilling certainty that she had not found this secret by chance. It had been waiting for her. The familiar, gnawing fear of poverty was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic taste of mortal terror. She felt hunted. Every sound from the surrounding woods, sound she had started to get used to, now seemed loaded with menace. The rustle of leaves was no longer a squirrel, it was a footstep. The snap of a twig was no longer a falling branch, it was someone watching her from the trees. Her isolation, which had once been a source of crushing despair, now felt like a tactical disadvantage of fatal proportions. She was a lone gazelle on an open plain, and she had just discovered the lion's hidden den. A primal urge to run, to grab her children and flee into the woods, seized her. But where would she go? The car was nearly out of gas, a useless metal shell. There was no one to call, nowhere to hide. She was trapped, a prisoner of geography and a secret that was growing heavier with every breath she took. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure panic. It was late afternoon when the sound came. It began as a low thrum, a vibration she felt more in her bones than heard with her ears. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet symphony of the lake. It was not the gentle putt-putt of a fisherman's trolling motor. This was a deep, powerful growl, the sound of an expensive engine slicing through the water with arrogant speed. Clara scrambled to the grimy window, her heart leaping into her throat. She peered through a crack in the cardboard she had taped over the broken pane. The sound grew louder, a confident roar that echoed off the dense wall of trees surrounding the clearing. It was getting closer. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Leo and Mia, sensing her sudden terror, stopped their quiet play and huddled against her legs, their small bodies trembling. A cold dread, absolute and paralyzing, washed over her. He had found them. The monster from the diary was coming. It was no longer a story on a page. It was a real physical threat, and it was seconds away. Through the gap, she saw it. A boat emerged from behind the point, a vision of startling, alien modernity against the backdrop of rotting wilderness. It was long and sleek, its fiberglass hull a brilliant, pristine white that seemed to suck all the light from the grey afternoon. It cut a sharp, clean wake through the dark. Placid water of the lake, its powerful engine settling into a low, menacing idle as it neared the shore. Clara felt her blood run cold. This was a vessel of wealth and power, the kind of boat that belonged to people who owned the world. A man stood at the helm, his form silhouetted against the grey sky. Even from a distance, she could see he was wearing a suit. He guided the boat expertly toward the rickety, half-submerged dock near the boat shed, a place of privilege docking at a port of decay. The contrast was sickening. Her throat went dry, her lungs refusing to draw a full breath. The name screamed in her mind, a silent, hysterical shriek. Valois, he killed the engine, and the sudden silence was more terrifying than the roar had been. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the wake against the shore and the frantic, suffocating beat of Clara's own heart. The man stepped from the boat onto the dock with a practiced, easy grace. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the mud and ruin. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, made a soft, squelching sound as he stepped off the dock and onto the marshy ground. Clara shrank back from the window, pulling her children with her, her mind a whirlwind of pure, unadulterated terror. He was walking toward the cabin. Each step was slow, deliberate, the crunch of his expensive leather shoes on the damp leaves and twigs sounding like cracks of a whip. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She felt cornered, a mouse trapped in a rotting box, and the cat was at the door, taking its time, savoring the moment. He didn't knock. He simply stopped a few feet from the broken porch, his presence a palpable force that seemed to suck the very air from the clearing. Clara forced herself to look. He was older than she'd imagined, perhaps in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair swept back from a tanned, unlined face. He was handsome, with the kind of practiced, easy charm that graced the covers of magazines. But his eyes, even from 20 feet away, were cold. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and they scanned the dilapidated cabin with a look of bored appraisal, missing nothing. He smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that did not reach his eyes. "Hello, the house," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "My sources tell me the old Vargas place is finally occupied. I thought I'd come and welcome my new neighbors." The word sources hung in the air, a chilling, casual display of his reach. He knew. Clara felt a tremor run through her body, but a strange, cold resolve settled over her. She had to face him. Hiding was not an option. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she pushed her children behind her and stepped out onto the crumbling porch, the rotting wood groaning under her weight. She stood there, small and disheveled in her worn-out clothes, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. She met his gaze. Up close, his eyes were even colder, like chips of ice, utterly devoid of warmth or empathy. He gave her another one of his seamless smiles. "Arthur Valois," he said, extending a hand he knew she was in no position to shake. "I own most of the land around this beautiful lake. This particular spot," he said, gesturing to the ruin around them, "is something of an eyesore on an otherwise perfect landscape. I'd like to take it off your hands. I'm prepared to offer you $5,000. Cash. A charitable gesture, really, considering its condition." The offer was a calculated insult, a clear message of how little he valued her life. $5,000. The words echoed in the space between them. It was a meaningless sum for a man like him, and a fortune for a woman like her. But Clara knew the true value of this land. It wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives that had been taken for it. The ledgers, the diary, they were a testament to its real worth. She felt a surge of something hot and defiant rise through her fear. Her voice, when it finally came, was a dry, cracking whisper, but it was steady. "It's not for sale." Valois' smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of cold, reptilian light. The mask of civility had slipped, just for a second, revealing the predator beneath. He studied her, his gaze sharp and analytical, as if reassessing a business problem. He was no longer just making an offer. He was taking her measure, calculating the amount of pressure required to make her break. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken violence. He let out a soft, humorless chuckle, a dry, rustling sound. "A woman of principle. I can appreciate that," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate, conspiratorial tone. "But principles don't feed children, do they, Ms.?" He let the question hang, knowing full well he hadn't asked her name. "This lake," he continued, turning his gaze toward the dark, still water. "It's a beautiful place, but it can be treacherous. The currents are unpredictable. The weather can turn in an instant." He looked back at her, his eyes boring into hers, pinning her in place. "Things get lost here. Boats, people, accidents happen." The words were delivered with the casual air of a weather report, but they landed like punches, each one stealing a little more of the air from her lungs. This was it. The threat, the same fate that had befallen the others, was now being laid at her feet, a choice between a pittance and a watery grave. Her blood ran cold. He took a half-step closer, lowering his voice even more, so only she could hear. "Your husband's uncle, Ricardo. A tragedy. What happened to him? He loved this lake, spent all his time on it, perhaps too much time." Valois' gaze was intense, searching her face for any flicker of recognition, any sign that she knew. He got careless. "It's a sad story." The explicit mention of Ricardo was the final turn of the screw. He was telling her, without saying it, that he knew who Ricardo was and what he had been doing. He was telling her that he was the one who had stopped him. He held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment, the silence stretching into an eternity. Then, his charming smile snapped back into place. "Think about my offer," he said brightly. He turned and walked back to his boat with the same unhurried, confident stride, leaving Clara standing frozen on the rotting porch, her body trembling uncontrollably. The sound of his engine starting up was the sound of a countdown beginning. The silence that descended after his boat disappeared was a living entity, a suffocating vacuum filled with the echo of his threats. Clara stumbled back inside the cabin, her legs barely holding her. She collapsed onto the floor, pulling her children into a desperate, trembling embrace. The full weight of her situation crashed down on her. Arthur Valois knew she was here. He thought she was just another squatter to be scared away or disposed of, but he didn't know she had the footlocker. He didn't know she had the proof, or did he? The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Was his visit a warning shot, or the prelude to an execution? The diary and the ledgers were no longer a story about the past. They were a prophecy of her own future if she made the wrong move. She was trapped, holding a weapon that could either save her or trigger her annihilation. What would you do in her place? Would you hand over the evidence and pray for mercy from a man who has none? Or would you risk everything, your own life and the lives of your children, for a justice you might not live to see? The roar of Arthur Valois' boat faded into the oppressive grey of the afternoon, leaving a silence that was more terrifying than the noise. The void he left behind was filled instantly by the frantic, hammering beat of Clara's own heart, a panicked drum against her ribs. She felt cold, a deep, cellular chill that had nothing to do with the damp lake air. It was the cold of a grave. His final words, "Accidents happen," echoed in the stillness, not as a threat, but as a prophecy. A wave of violent nausea rose in her throat, and she had to grip the splintered railing of the porch to keep from collapsing. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a storm of pure terror shaking her from the inside out. The air, thick with the smell of rot and damp earth, felt too thin to breathe. He hadn't just visited her, he had branded her, marking her as the next obstacle to be removed. The world, which had already shrunk to the size of this decaying cabin, now felt like a coffin, and the lid was being nailed shut, one polite, menacing word at a time. She stumbled back into the cabin's gloom, the familiar stench of mold and decay, now mingled with the fresh, sharp scent of her own fear. The single room felt smaller, the shadows in the corners deeper and more menacing. They seemed to writhe and pulse in time with her ragged breathing. She looked at Leo and Mia, who were huddled together by the door, their faces pale masks of confusion and fear. Leo's small hand was still clutching her jeans, his knuckles white. The sight of their innocence, their utter dependence on her, was a physical blow, a pain sharper than any threat Valois could utter. Her failure as a provider had been a crushing weight, but this was infinitely worse. She had not led them to a shelter. She had led them into a predator's hunting ground. Her desperation had made her blind, and now her children were standing in the crosshairs of a monster, all because she had dared to hope. The crushing guilt was a stone in her stomach, heavier and colder than any despair she had known before. She was no longer just poor, she was a danger to her own children. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of impossible scenarios. She could run, but the car was a useless metal coffin with a near-empty gas tank. She could hide, but for how long? Valois' casual mention of sources proved that this remote patch of wilderness was no shield. He had eyes everywhere. He would find them. She felt utterly, hopelessly trapped, a fly caught in a spider's web, the vibrations of the approaching predator traveling through every strand. Her gaze swept frantically around the clearing, desperate for an escape route that didn't exist. Then her eyes settled on the lake. It was a vast, dark, unblinking eye. Reflecting the grim, colorless sky, she remembered something she had dismissed as a trick of the light on one of the first sleepless nights here. A faint, solitary pinprick of light far across the water. It had flickered, a tiny, defiant spark in the immense darkness before vanishing. At the time it meant nothing. Now, it was the only thing in the entire world that wasn't this cabin, that wasn't under the shadow of Valois. A plan, born of pure animal desperation, began to form in her mind. It was an insane gamble, a Hail Mary thrown into the void. She had to cross the lake. She had no idea who or what was over there. It could be another abandoned shack. It could be someone who worked for Valois. It could be nothing at all. But the known threat of Arthur Valois, with his cold eyes and veiled promises of drowning, was a certainty. The unknown, for the first time, felt like the safer bet. It was a choice between a definite death sentence and a sliver of a chance. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold, chemical courage that temporarily burned away the paralytic fear. Her decision solidified. They would not wait here like lambs for the slaughter. They would take their chances on the water in the dark. She had to believe that anything, even the black, unknown depths of the lake, was better than waiting for the sound of his boat returning. The spark of light was a destination, a question mark she had to answer. As twilight began to bleed into the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and gray, Clara went to the collapsed boat shed, the place where she had found the footlocker. The air inside was still and cold, thick with the smell of stagnant water and decay. Tucked away in the corner, half filled with slimy rainwater and leaves, was a small wooden rowboat. It was a wreck, its paint peeled away, its wood waterlogged and dark. It looked as if it would disintegrate the moment it touched the water, but it was all she had. With a strength born of terror, she began to heave the boat out of the muck, the wet wood groaning in protest. Her muscles screamed, her hands, already raw from days of labor, were scraped and bruised. Leo tried to help, his small body pushing with all its might, his face set with a grim determination that broke her heart. Finally, with a great sucking sound, the boat came free and they dragged it, inch by painful inch, to the water's edge. The sun had completely vanished by the time she was ready. A sliver of moon offered a pathetic, ghostly light that did little to pierce the profound, smothering darkness. She bundled the children into the boat, wrapping them in the single clean blanket she owned. She put the heavy, rusted footlocker in the center, its weight a dangerous anchor. Her hands trembled as she pushed off from the shore, the boat scraping against the gravel before finally floating free. The black water of the lake was shockingly cold as it lapped over the sides, soaking her jeans. She fumbled for the oars, their wet, rough wood unfamiliar and clumsy in her hands. The oarlocks creaked a rhythmic, mournful complaint with every pull. The cabin and the clearing were swallowed by the darkness behind her almost immediately, leaving her utterly adrift in a world of black water and black sky. The only reality was the burning in her arms and the cold that seeped into her very bones. Fear was a living thing in the boat with them. The darkness was absolute, a disorienting void that stripped away all sense of direction and distance. Every sound was magnified. The gentle splash of the oars, the gurgle of water against the hull, the distant, lonely call of a loon, they all sounded alien and menacing. The water itself felt malevolent, a cold black abyss that promised a silent, breathless end. Clara's imagination, fueled by Valois' words, conjured images of unpredictable currents pulling them under, of a sudden storm rising out of the blackness. She felt a constant, trickling dampness at her feet and realized with a surge of panic that the boat was taking on water, a slow but steady leak. Her heart pounded in her throat. She rowed with a frantic, desperate energy, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She was a tiny, insignificant speck, a fragile shell of rotting wood, carrying all she had left in the world across an endless, indifferent sea of black. Mia had cried herself to sleep, her small body curled into a tight ball under the blanket, but Leo was wide awake. He sat ramrod straight, his small hands gripping the cold, wet bench. He didn't make a sound, but in the faint moonlight, Clara could see his eyes, huge and dark in his pale face, fixed on her. They were filled with a terrifying adult understanding. He knew this was not an adventure. He knew they were running for their lives. His silent, watchful gaze was both a source of strength and an unbearable burden. She was his mother, his protector, and she was rowing them into the heart of a vast, dark unknown in a boat that was actively sinking. The shame and fear were a toxic cocktail in her gut. She forced her arms to keep moving, to pull the heavy oars through the resistant water, ignoring the fire in her shoulders and the scream building in her own throat. She had to be strong for him. She had to get them to the other side. His fear was a reflection of her own, and she couldn't bear it. She focused on a single point in the distance, the light. It was there again, a tiny, flickering star in the impenetrable wall of blackness on the far shore. It seemed impossibly far away. It became her mantra, her reason, her entire universe. Pull, breathe, light, pull, breathe, light. The rhythmic agony of the movement was the only thing that kept her mind from spiraling into pure panic. Her muscles, unused to this kind of labor, felt as if they were being shredded. Her lungs burned with every intake of the cold, damp air. The water at her feet was deeper now, sloshing around her ankles with every movement of the boat. She was losing time. She was losing strength. The light didn't seem to be getting any closer. Despair, a cold and familiar enemy, began to creep back into her thoughts, whispering that this was futile, that she had traded a quick death on land for a slow, freezing one on the water. But then she looked at Leo's face, and she pulled the oars again with a guttural sob of effort. Just as she felt the last of her strength give out, her arms turning to lead, the bottom of the boat scraped against something hard with a loud jarring crunch. Gravel. Land. She had made it. A wave of profound, dizzying relief washed over her. So potent, it almost buckled her knees. She half fell, half stumbled out of the boat into the shallow, icy water, her legs trembling too violently to stand. She dragged the heavy, waterlogged boat further onto a small, pebbly shore, her breath coming in painful, heaving sobs. She was gasping for air, her body screaming in protest, but she was on solid ground. She turned and looked back across the water. The lake was a vast, featureless expanse of black. She couldn't even see the other side anymore. It felt as if she had crossed an ocean, an impossible distance between two worlds. Her entire body ached with a deep, throbbing exhaustion, but for the first time since Valois' visit, she felt a flicker, not of hope, but of possibility. She had acted. She had moved. A narrow, trodden path led up from the small beach, disappearing into the dark trees, and there, nestled in a small clearing, was the source of the light. It was a tiny shack, barely bigger than a single room, built of sturdy, dark logs. A thin, pale ribbon of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a comforting domestic sight in the menacing wilderness. A single oil lantern hung from a hook by the door, casting a small, welcoming circle of warm, yellow light onto the ground. The contrast with her own dilapidated, lightless cabin was so stark it was painful. This was not a place of decay. This was a home, however humble. It was a place of warmth and life. The soft glow of the lantern was a beacon in the oppressive darkness, a symbol of defiance against the night. She gathered her children, pulling them close, and started walking slowly, cautiously, up the path, her heart a wild, uncertain drum in her chest. The closer she got, the more details she could see. The shack was meticulously maintained. Neat stacks of split firewood were piled high against one wall. Fishing nets, smelling faintly of the lake, were hung to dry on wooden racks. A small, well-tended herb garden grew in pots near the single window. The air smelled of clean pine smoke and the faint, savory aroma of fish soup. This was the home of someone who lived in harmony with their surroundings, not someone fighting against them. It was a place of order and purpose, the absolute antithesis of the chaos and ruin she had left behind. She felt a pang of something akin to envy, but it was quickly overwhelmed by a raw, desperate need. This was her last chance. This small, warm circle of light was the only thing standing between her family and the vast, cold darkness at their backs. She took a deep, shaky breath and stepped into the light. She raised her hand to knock, but hesitated. Who lived here? What would they think of a half-drowned woman and two terrified children appearing on their doorstep in the middle of the night, dragging a rusted box of secrets, but the thought of Valois, of his cold eyes and the sound of his boat, propelled her forward. Her knuckles rapped against the solid wood of the door. The sound was shockingly loud, an intrusion into the peaceful silence. For a long moment, there was no answer. She could hear the crackle of the fire inside, but nothing else. Her hope began to curdle into fear. Maybe no one was home. Maybe they wouldn't answer. Then, she heard a faint shuffling sound from within, followed by the metallic click of a bolt being drawn. The door opened a few inches, a sliver of warm light cutting through the darkness. An eye appeared in the crack. It was an old eye, cloudy and pale blue, and it was filled with a wary, deep-seated suspicion. Then she saw the glint of a shotgun barrel, held steady, pointing right at her chest. The man's face, illuminated by the lantern light, was a roadmap of a long and difficult life. He looked ancient, his skin weathered and leathery like old parchment, carved with 1,000 deep wrinkles. A messy mane of white hair fell over his brow, and his pale eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and intense. He radiated an aura of reclusive self-sufficiency, a man who had not welcomed a visitor in a very long time and was not happy to be starting now. "What do you want?" His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like stones grinding together. It was the voice of a man who used words sparingly. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the darkness behind her, searching for threats. His entire posture was defensive, coiled, a wild creature startled from its den. Clara's throat was tight with fear, her own voice trapped behind a wall of panic. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. Her desperation finally broke the paralysis. The words came out in a torrent, a jumbled, breathless plea. "Please, I'm sorry to bother you. I saw your light from across the lake." She gestured vaguely back towards the black water. "My children, we have nowhere else to go. A man came to my cabin today. He threatened us." The old man's expression didn't change. His gaze remained hard, his grip on the shotgun unwavering. He had likely heard stories from strangers before. But then Clara said the name, the word that had been burning in her mind like a hot coal. His name was Arthur Valois. At the sound of that name, a visible change came over the man. The suspicion in his eyes was instantly eclipsed by something else, something deeper and more potent. It was the flash of an old, familiar terror, the recognition of a shared enemy. The barrel of the shotgun lowered an inch. He finally looked directly at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Her drenched clothes, her terrified face, the two small children huddled behind her. "Get inside," he rasped, his voice urgent. "Now, and put out that damned lantern." He unbolted the door and swung it open, revealing a small, impossibly warm and cluttered room. He quickly ushered them in from the cold, his movements surprisingly swift for a man of his age. He shut the door behind them and slid the heavy wooden bolt back into place, the sound a definitive thud of finality. The room was a sanctuary of warmth and life. Books were stacked on every surface, fishing gear was tangled in a corner, and a black pot bubbled over a fire in a large stone hearth. It smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and brewing coffee. He pointed to a worn armchair near the fire. "Sit," he commanded, then disappeared for a moment, returning with a thick wool blanket and 2 mugs of what smelled like warm, sweetened milk. He handed them to Leo and Mia without a word, his gnarled, fisherman's hands surprisingly gentle as he did so. He hadn't introduced himself, but in that small gesture, Clara saw a flicker of kindness beneath the crusty exterior. Clara, wrapped in a rough blanket he had given her, began to talk, the warmth of the fire and the man's quiet. Intense presence seemed to unlock something inside her, and the whole story poured out. She told him about David's death, the eviction, the desperate journey to the cabin that turned out to be a ruin. She told him about the chilling draft, the loose floorboard, and Leo finding the tarnished brass key. Her voice cracked as she described finding the footlocker in the muck of the boat shed. She explained what was inside, the ledgers, the tape, and the diary. She saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a deep sadness. She told him about Valois' visit that afternoon, repeating his threat, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "He knows I'm in his way," she whispered, tears finally streaming down her face, hot and fast. "He thinks I'm just another problem to be removed." She felt herself unraveling, the terror and exhaustion of the past 24 hours culminating in a storm of helpless sobs in front of this complete stranger. The old man listened to her entire story without saying a word, his pale eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. But when she mentioned the name of her husband's uncle, the man who had written the diary, his stony facade finally broke. "Ricardo Vargas," she said, and the man closed his eyes, a spasm of profound pain crossing his face. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of ancient grief. "Ricardo," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He wasn't just some distant relative, girl. Ricardo was my friend, my only friend. He stood up and walked to the small, grimy window, peering out into the darkness as if he could see the past playing out on the surface of the lake. "I told him to leave it alone. I told him Valois was a snake, and you don't corner a snake unless you intend to kill it. But he was a stubborn fool, a righteous fool." His voice was thick with a mixture of anger and love. He believed in justice. He turned back from the window, his face a grim mask of memory. "I saw it," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper that sent a fresh shiver down Clara's spine. The night of his accident. I was out on the lake, checking my lines further down the shore. It was a moonless night, just like this one. I heard an engine, not a fishing boat, something big, powerful. He paused, the memory clearly painful. I saw Valois' boat, that big white monster of his, racing away from Ricardo's dock. He was running without lights, a dark shape moving way too fast. I knew then, in my gut, I knew Valois had finally done it. He sank back into his chair, the weight of the decade-old secret seeming to crush him. I never said a word, to anyone. I was a coward. I've been living with that, hiding over here like a hermit for 10 years. I let him get away with murdering my friend. His confession hung in the air, thick and heavy as smoke. "Ricardo told me everything," Silas continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He was so excited when he found those ledgers. He showed them to me right here in this room. He'd figured out the whole scheme. The shell companies, the payoffs. He knew Valois was behind the fires, the accidents. He was building a fortress of proof." The old man shook his head, a look of bitter regret on his face. "But he needed more. He wasn't satisfied with circumstantial evidence. He wanted a confession. He found a weak link, a state inspector on Valois' payroll, and he squeezed him. 'That tape,' he said, looking at Clara with a new intensity. 'That tape is Ricardo's last will and testament. It's the voice of the man who signed his death warrant. It's the proof he died for.' The reality of what she possessed, what she had dragged across the lake in a sinking boat, hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just evidence, it was a ghost. It was Ricardo's final, desperate cry for justice. Silas leaned forward, his expression suddenly sharp and practical, the grief momentarily replaced by a hunter's focus. "Valois won't wait long now. Your refusal to sell, your presence in that cabin, it spooked him. He's not a man who tolerates loose ends. He's a cornered animal, and he will strike. He'll send men, not to talk. They'll come for that box." He looked at her, his pale eyes deadly serious. "You cannot fight them. You cannot reason with them. When they come, you must run. You take your children and you run into the woods. Don't follow a path, just run." He thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "Listen to me carefully. The animals in this forest, they have their own language. If you're in danger, you can use it." He brought his tongue to the roof of his mouth and made a sharp, strange clicking sound, almost like a bird's chirp, but more frantic. "Do that 3 times, fast and loud. It's the alarm call of a squirrel. The deer. They know that sound. It means a predator is near. They will panic and bolt. It will cause a commotion, noise, movement. It might only buy you 10 seconds, but 10 seconds can be the difference between life and death." Clara spent the rest of the night in Silas's armchair, the footlocker at her feet, a shotgun resting across her lap. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. Every creak of the shack, every sigh of the wind, was the sound of approaching doom. At the first sign of dawn, a grim grey light that promised another day of fear, she knew she had to go back. She couldn't endanger Silas, and the men would come to her cabin first. Silas gave her a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and a solemn, desperate look. The journey back across the lake in the daylight was surreal, the water calm and placid, belying the terror of the night before. The rest of the day was a long, slow-motion nightmare. Every hour that passed stretched her nerves tighter. She packed a small bag with the diary, the ledgers, and the tape. The footlocker was too heavy to run with. She had to leave it, a decoy. Late in the afternoon, she found it. A single piece of paper was pinned to her front door with a large, wicked-looking hunting knife. The note had only 5 words, written in a bold black script. 10 p.m. Take the money. The sun set, and the darkness that fell was no longer just the absence of light. It was an active, malevolent presence. Clara didn't light a lamp. She and the children huddled in the darkest corner of the room, away from the windows. The bag of evidence was clutched in her hand. 10 o'clock came and went. The silence stretched, becoming a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Every nerve in her body screamed. She was a string on a violin, pulled tighter and tighter, about to snap. And then, a sound. It was subtle at first, a low crunching on the dirt track leading to the cabin. It was not Valois' powerful boat. It was a heavy vehicle, moving slowly, cautiously. An engine was cut, and the silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. Then the slamming of 2 car doors, a sound that cracked the night open like a whip. Heavy footsteps, clumsy, brutish. They were on the porch. Clara held her breath, pressing her hand over Mia's mouth to stifle a whimper. A fist hammered on the door, a series of violent, impatient blows that shook the entire fragile structure. "Open up! Valois sent us!" a rough voice bellowed. When there was no answer, there was a moment of silence, followed by the sickening sound of a heavy boot splintering the wood of the door near the handle. With a final, violent kick, the door flew open, crashing against the interior wall. 2 large, hulking shapes filled the doorway, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. They were mountains of muscle and menace, their faces hidden in shadow. One of them flicked on a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and sweeping across the room. "He said she'd be here," one of them grunted, his voice a low growl. "Find the box, and then we find her." Their casual brutality, the assumption that she was little more than an insect to be dealt with after the real prize was secured, sent a fresh wave of icy terror through Clara's veins. They began to tear the cabin apart. Their movements were not frantic. They were methodical, brutally efficient. The flashlight beam danced manically around the room as they worked. They overturned the rickety table with a loud crash, sending her few remaining tin plates clattering across the floor. One of them kicked the stained mattress, sending up a cloud of dust and mold spores. They tore the cardboard from the windows, letting the cold night air and the pale, ghostly moonlight flood the room. The sound of destruction was overwhelming, the splintering of wood, the ripping of fabric, the grunts of effort. Clara remained frozen in the corner, shielded by the deepest shadows, her body a rigid pillar of terror. She clutched her children to her, their small bodies trembling violently against hers. She could feel Leo's heart hammering as fast as her own. The men were getting closer, their flashlight beams sweeping back and forth, methodically searching every inch of the room. One of the men spotted the footlocker, half hidden under a pile of dirty blankets. "There it is," he grunted with satisfaction. He kicked the blankets aside and knelt, examining the lock. "It's the one. Let's get it and go." The other man, however, was more thorough. His flashlight beam continued its slow, deliberate sweep of the room. Valois said to be sure, "Check for any other papers." The beam slid across the floor, closer and closer to the corner where Clara and her children were hiding. It was inches away. She could feel the heat of the light on her skin. It was now or never. Her mind screamed. She had to make the sound. It felt insane, a child's game against 2 monsters, but it was all she had. The beam touched the edge of her shoe. She saw the man's head turn, his eyes trying to pierce the deep shadow. It was the last second she would ever have. Taking a ragged, desperate breath, Clara pressed her tongue against the roof of her mouth and produced the sound Silas had taught her. It came out as a weak, pathetic chirp. She tried again, forcing all her fear and desperation into it. A sharp, frantic, clicking sound. She did it again, and then a third time, louder, more piercing. The sound cut through the tense silence of the cabin. For a split second, nothing happened. The men just froze, confused. Then, from the darkness outside, came a sudden, explosive crashing sound. A large deer, which had been grazing peacefully just beyond the tree line, had been startled by the predator alarm. It panicked, bolting directly through a thick patch of underbrush with a tremendous racket of snapping branches and panicked hooves. "What the hell was that?" one of the men growled, his attention completely diverted as he spun toward the broken window, trying to see the source of the commotion. It was only a moment, a heartbeat, but it was enough. The flashlight beam was no longer on her. Both men were distracted, looking out into the darkness. "Now," Clara whispered, her voice a raw, urgent command. She grabbed the bag of evidence with one hand and the hands of her children with the other. Adrenaline surged through her, a powerful cleansing fire. She was no longer a victim hiding in a corner. She was a mother protecting her young. She exploded from the shadow, lunging not for the main entrance where the men stood, but for the flimsy, rotted back door she had unlatched hours earlier. It led to the darkest side of the cabin, directly into the woods. They burst through the doorway and into the pitch-black night, just as the men shouted in surprise behind them. They didn't look back. They plunged into the terrifying, tangled darkness of the forest, the sounds of angry pursuit erupting behind them, running blindly toward the memory of a path and a tiny, distant circle of light. They burst into the warmth of Silas's shack, a whirlwind of cold air, wet leaves, and ragged, panicked breaths. Clara collapsed against the heavy wooden door, her body a single trembling nerve, while Silas quickly bolted it behind them. The small room, which had felt like a sanctuary hours before, now felt like a final, desperate foxhole. The air smelled of pine smoke and the metallic tang of Clara's own terror. Silas didn't waste a moment. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled her toward a small, curtained-off alcove in the back. "There is only one way now," he rasped, his voice a low growl of grim determination. He pulled back the curtain to reveal a massive, ancient ham radio set, its dials and gauges glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. It looked like the control panel of a forgotten spaceship. Clara clutched the bag of evidence to her chest, its weight both a terrible burden and their only hope. The sounds of her own heart and the distant, angry shouts from across the lake seemed to merge into a single, terrifying rhythm of doom. Silas dropped into the chair in front of the radio, his gnarled fingers flying across the controls with a speed and certainty that defied his age. A deafening hiss and crackle filled the room, the sound of a million dead conversations trying to break through the static. Clara watched, mesmerized, as he spun the large tuning dial. The air filled with ghostly fragments of voices, bursts of music, and the strange, rhythmic beeping of Morse code. He was hunting for a specific frequency, a ghost on the airwaves he hadn't contacted in over a decade. He grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white. "This is Kilo Sierra 7 Niner, calling Archangel. I repeat, Kilo Sierra 7 Niner, calling Archangel." His voice was low, urgent, stripped of all its crusty affectation, leaving only the cold precision of a soldier making a final report from the field. He repeated the call again and again into the static-filled void, the silence between each transmission stretching into an agonizing eternity. Clara held her breath, feeling the weight of Ricardo's life, and now her own, hanging in the balance of this electronic séance. For a moment that felt like a lifetime, there was only the roar of the static. Then a new sound cut through the noise, a crisp, clear voice that seemed impossibly close. "Sierra Niner, this is Archangel. We read you. It's been a long time, old friend." "I thought you were a ghost." A wave of dizziness washed over Clara. They had heard someone was there. Silas leaned into the microphone, his voice a strained whisper. "No time, Marcus. It's about Ricardo. The case was never cold. I have his proof, all of it. The ledgers, the diary, a taped confession." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "And I have the woman who found it. She has children. Valois knows she's here. He's sent men. They're on my doorstep." The prosecutor, Marcus, didn't hesitate. His voice came back sharp and commanding, the sound of immense authority snapping into action. "Protect the evidence. Protect the witness. Do not engage. We are moving. I'm sending a TAC team. Tell me where you are." Silas gave him the coordinates, a string of numbers that pinpointed his tiny shack in the vast wilderness. Hope, real and powerful, finally broke through Clara's terror. The handoff took place just before dawn. on a deserted logging road miles from the lake. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of pine and wet earth. Two black, unmarked sedans materialized out of the morning mist, their engines a low, powerful hum. Men in dark, practical suits emerged, their faces grim and professional, their movements economical and precise. Clara felt impossibly small and exposed under their serious gaze. A tall man with tired eyes and a kind face introduced himself as Federal Prosecutor Marcus Vance. He was Archangel. He looked at Clara, then at the two small children hiding behind her legs, and a flicker of something deeply human crossed his face. "You did a brave thing, Miss Alvis. A very brave thing." Clara's hands trembled as she handed him the worn canvas bag. The transfer felt monumental, the passing of a sacred, terrible burden. As her fingers let go of the strap, a decade of Ricardo's lonely fight and her own week of terror seemed to lift from her shoulders. She felt light, empty, and for the first time in an eternity, profoundly safe. The news broke 2 nights later, not with a whisper, but with a roar. The scene shifted from the quiet anonymity of the federal safe house to the glittering opulence of Arthur Valois' sprawling lakeside mansion. A charity gala was in full swing, a symphony of privilege and power. The air was thick with the smells of expensive champagne and rare orchids. The sounds were a gentle murmur of polite laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the elegant strains of a string quartet playing Vivaldi. Arthur Valois, looking regal in a black tuxedo, stood on a small stage, a golden trophy in his hand, bathing in the warm glow of a spotlight and the adulation of his peers. He was accepting an award for his generous contributions to the community, his smile a perfect, practiced mask of humble benevolence. It was the absolute apex of his public persona, the master manipulator playing his most beloved role. Then, through the classical music, a new sound began to intrude, a distant, piercing wail that grew rapidly, horribly, louder. It was the sound of sirens. The music faltered and died. A wave of confusion rippled through the well-dressed crowd as the manic flashing of red and blue lights began to strobe through the mansion's massive picture windows, painting the panicked faces of the guests in garish, frantic colors. Before anyone could truly process what was happening, the grand ballroom doors burst open. It was not more guests arriving. It was a swarm of heavily armed federal police officers in full tactical gear, their black uniforms a stark, brutal intrusion into the world of white linen and diamonds. They moved with terrifying efficiency, securing the room, their shouts of "Federal police, nobody move," cutting through the stunned silence. Valois stood frozen on the stage, the trophy still in his hand, his face a canvas of disbelief that was rapidly curdling into pure, unrestrained fury. The spotlight that had been his anointment just seconds before was now an interrogation lamp, pinning him in place for the whole world to see his true self. Prosecutor Marcus Vance stepped through the chaos, walking directly to the stage. He held up a single microcassette tape. "Arthur Valois," his voice boomed through the silent room, amplified by a bullhorn. "This is a recording of you confessing to the murder of State Inspector Thomas Albright. You are under arrest for that murder, and for the murder of Ricardo Vargas, and for the racketeering and conspiracy that destroyed the lives of dozens of families around this lake." The satisfyingly loud click of handcuffs being snapped onto Valois' wrists echoed through the ballroom. His mask of civility finally shattered completely, revealing the snarling, venomous predator beneath. He lunged, but was restrained. News cameras, embedded with the federal team, flashed relentlessly, capturing every moment of his downfall. Watching the broadcast later on a small TV, Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, tears of pure, cathartic vindication streaming down her cheeks. The ghost had been heard. The monster had been caged. It was over. Weeks later, Clara sat in a quiet, sunlit office that smelled of old books and strong as fresh coffee. The contrast with the damp, moldy cabin was so profound, it made her dizzy. Prosecutor Vance sat across from her, a thick stack of documents on the polished mahogany desk between them. He explained that Valois' arrest had caused a domino effect, bringing his entire corrupt network crashing down. The stolen lands were being legally restored to the surviving families or sods in cases like hers, to their rightful heirs. "Your uncle was a hero, Miss Alves," Vance said softly. "He built the case, brick by brick. All it needed was a spark, You were that spark. He then pushed a final document across the desk. And because your testimony and the evidence you secured led directly to the closing of a major cold case, the state is awarding you the full reward money that was posted a decade ago. He tapped a number at the bottom of the page. It was a sum so vast, so life-altering, that Clara's vision blurred. It wasn't just money. It was justice. It was safety. It was a future. She returned to the lake, but not to the ruin. The cabin stood on the same spot, but it was a completely different structure. The oppressive smell of decay was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of new pine and fresh paint. A crew of cheerful builders hammered and sawed, their work a symphony of renewal. The collapsed porch was now a wide, welcoming deck. The shattered windows were replaced with large, clear panes that reflected the blue sky. The sagging, broken roof had been rebuilt, strong and true. The disease of the place had been surgically removed, the rot cut away and replaced with something healthy and full of promise. Clara stood on the shore, the gentle lapping of the water now a soothing sound, not a menacing one. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face, a simple, profound pleasure. The cabin was being resurrected, its wounded frame healed, its dark past erased. It was a reflection of her own spirit, being painstakingly rebuilt from the ground up, stronger than before. The seasons turned. A deep, quiet snow now blanketed the woods, turning the landscape into a pristine world of white. Inside the finished cabin, a fire roared in the new stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the smooth wooden walls. The rich, savory aroma of a hearty beef stew filled the air, a scent of abundance and comfort. At a sturdy oak table, Leo and Mia laughed as they drew with a huge box of new crayons, their world no longer grey and fearful, but filled with vibrant colour. In a corner of the room, Clara sat at her own brand-new sewing machine. Its quiet, powerful hum was a song of creation. The fabric gliding through her fingers was not a patch for a worn-out garment, but a swath of deep blue velvet, destined to become a beautiful dress, just because. She looked at her children, safe and happy, at the warmth of her home, and felt a peace so deep it was almost overwhelming. The $200, the eviction, the hunger, it all felt like a story about someone else, a lifetime ago. She had been led into a tomb and had managed to turn it into a sanctuary. She had been handed a curse and had forged it into a key, unlocking not just justice for Ricardo and the other victims, but a future for her children she never could have dreamed of. The lake, which had once been a black mirror reflecting her deepest fears, was now a beautiful, peaceful vista outside her window, a constant reminder of the depth she had crossed and the strength she had found within herself. Clara's story is a testament to the fact that even in the most profound darkness, when all hope seems lost, the courage of a single person can be enough to start a fire that burns away the shadows and reveals the truth. What would you have done with Ricardo's secret? If her incredible journey from the brink of despair to hard-won redemption resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of survival and the relentless pursuit of justice.